It was a quiet morning in the small town of Maple Ridge, the kind of place where everyone knew someone who knew everyone else. David Parker, a 45-year-old taxi driver, was beginning his day like he always did. He sipped the last of his lukewarm coffee in his kitchen, grabbed his cap from the counter, and waved goodbye to his wife, Anna, as she prepared breakfast for their teenage son. Life for David wasn't extraordinary, far from it. A few years back, he had given up on his small repair shop after mounting bills pushed him into a corner. Driving a taxi became his way of keeping food on the table and saving what little he could. For David, mornings were his favorite. The roads were empty, the sun peeked lazily over the hills, and his old taxi hummed as though happy to be moving. The familiar rhythm of Maple Ridge unfolded before him, shopkeepers opening their shutters, kids waving goodbye to parents as school buses pulled up, and the occasional early riser jogging on the sidewalks. He loved this small town for its simplicity, but even in places like this, life had its share of hardship. That particular morning, David's taxi had been quiet for the first hour. He parked at his usual spot near the town square, leaning back into his seat and adjusting the rear-view mirror. He glanced at his watch, 7:30 a.m. He could hear the faint sound of birds chirping, punctuated by the distant honk of cars in the main street. Then, through his windshield, David noticed a woman standing at the corner, holding a little boy's hand. She looked frantic, her face pale and her hair tied hastily into a loose ponytail. She wasn't just waiting, she was pacing, looking in all directions like she was searching for someone. David instinctively pulled forward, his tires crunching the gravel as he stopped near the sidewalk. He rolled down the window and called out, "Need a ride, ma'am?" The woman startled slightly, turning toward him with red-rimmed eyes. She was clutching the boy's hand so tightly that her knuckles were white. "Yes, please," she stammered. "The hospital. Fast. Please." David nodded and unlocked the back doors. The woman helped her son climb into the back seat and then slid in beside him, her hands trembling as she settled in. David stole a glance at the boy in the rearview mirror. He was no older than 6, his small face tucked into his mother's shoulder as though he didn't want to be seen. The boy was quiet, but something about the way he clung to his mother told David that whatever was happening wasn't ordinary. "Everything okay?" David asked softly, turning the key in the ignition. The woman hesitated, her voice shaky as she replied, "Please. Just hurry." David didn't press further. Whatever it was, he could sense it wasn't something to pry into. He pulled away from the curb, carefully picking up speed as they headed toward Maple Ridge General Hospital. The road stretched long and straight, bordered by sleepy houses and open fields. David glanced at the woman occasionally in the mirror. She looked exhausted, her face streaked with tears that she wiped away when she thought no one was looking. "It's going to be all right," David muttered instinctively, though he wasn't sure if the woman heard him. The drive took less than 10 minutes, though for David, it felt longer. He pulled up to the hospital's entrance, where a few nurses were hurrying in and out of the automatic glass doors. Before the car had come to a full stop, the woman leaned over, fishing through her worn-out purse for money. Her hands trembled uncontrollably as she fumbled for a few bills. "Wait," David said, turning slightly in his seat. "Don't worry about it." The woman froze, looking at him like she didn't understand what he'd said. "What?" "It's fine," David repeated, gesturing with his hand. "Go take care of your boy. Don't worry about the fare." The woman's face crumpled in disbelief. No, I can't. Please, you've been kind, but I need to pay." David shook his head firmly. "You don't owe me a thing. Go on now. He needs you more." The boy lifted his head just then, his small voice breaking the silence. "Thank you, mister." David gave him a gentle smile, but before he could say anything more, the woman was already helping her son out of the taxi. She paused at the door, turning back to David with tears spilling freely down her face. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered. "God bless you." And with that, she hurried through the hospital doors, the little boy stumbling beside her. David watched them disappear into the building, his heart unexpectedly heavy. There was something about the moment, about the woman's desperation and the boy's quiet, innocent gratitude, that lingered with him as he drove off. The rest of the day went by like any other. David picked up a few more fares, an older gentleman going to the grocery store, a pair of teenagers chattering about school. But his mind kept drifting back to the woman and her son. Who were they? What had happened to bring them to such a state? He shook off the thoughts. After all, taxi drivers met all kinds of people. You learned to leave their stories behind once they walked out of the cab. By the time evening rolled around, David parked his taxi in its usual spot behind his house and stepped inside. The faint smell of soup greeted him, and Anna was humming to herself as she stirred a pot on the stove. Their son, Josh, sat at the kitchen table, bent over a math book. It was an ordinary night, warm and comforting, but David still couldn't shake the memory of the woman's face. Later, as he sat in his old recliner with a cup of tea, his phone rang unexpectedly. The screen flashed with an unknown number. David frowned but answered. "Hello? Is this Mr. Parker?" a formal voice asked. "Yes, speaking. Mr. Parker, this is Dr. Ellis from Maple Ridge General Hospital. I believe you drove a woman and her son to us earlier today." David's heart skipped a beat. "Yes, I did. Is everything all right?" There was a pause on the other end, and then the doctor's voice softened. "Mr. Parker, I don't know if you realize the gravity of what you did today. The boy, he was in critical condition. A severe allergic reaction. If you hadn't brought them here when you did, he wouldn't have made it." David sat up straight, his heart hammering in his chest. "What? You saved his life, Mr. Parker," the doctor said gently. "The mother wanted us to contact you. She insisted you know how much your kindness meant to her." David couldn't find the words. He sat there, phone pressed to his ear, as the weight of the situation sank in. A part of him wanted to dismiss it as coincidence, he'd just been doing his job, after all. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. That morning, when he refused the woman's money, something bigger had been at play. The doctor continued, "She said she'll reach out to you soon. I just wanted to let you know personally, sometimes, the smallest acts make the biggest difference." When David finally hung up the phone, his hands were trembling. Anna looked at him curiously from across the room. "Who was that?" David swallowed hard, his voice quiet as he replied, "A doctor. That little boy, he would have died if I hadn't driven them to the hospital." For a moment, the room was silent. Anna set down her cup, her face softening with pride and awe. "You did that, David?" "I guess so," David whispered, still trying to process everything. As he sat there in the quiet of his home, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the background, David realized something. Sometimes, you didn't need to be rich or powerful to make a difference. Sometimes, all it took was a taxi driver who refused a fare and chose kindness instead. Little did David know that this was only the beginning. The next morning, the sun rose as it always did over Maple Ridge, bathing the small town in a soft orange glow. Life carried on like clockwork. Shopkeepers unlocked their doors, morning joggers tied their sneakers, and buses groaned to a start as they picked up clusters of sleepy schoolchildren. It was just another day, yet for David Parker, everything felt different. The phone call from the hospital the night before still weighed heavily on his mind. He couldn't stop thinking about the woman and her little boy. The boy had been moments away from a tragedy that David had unknowingly prevented. It was a thought that both humbled and unsettled him. He wasn't used to being in the center of anything. In his quiet life as a taxi driver, his job was to be invisible, a cog in the background of other people's lives. But now, for the first time, he'd found himself at the heart of something profound. He saved a life. It didn't make sense. Him? David Parker? Just a man in an old taxi with a worn-out engine? The house felt unusually quiet that morning. Anna had already left to work her shift at the bakery, and their teenage son Josh was still asleep, his door ajar with the muffled sound of cartoons playing softly on his phone. David brewed his coffee and sat at the kitchen table, staring into the mug as if it held answers. His phone buzzed, and he startled slightly before snatching it up. It was an unknown number again. His heart jumped. He hesitated for just a moment before answering. "Hello? Mr. Parker?" It was the same voice from the hospital, Dr. Ellis. "I'm sorry to disturb you again so early." No, it's fine," David said quickly, his fingers drumming nervously on the table. "Is something wrong?" "Not at all," the doctor replied warmly. "Actually, I wanted to let you know that the mother, her name is Claire, is very insistent on meeting you. She was quite emotional last night, as you can imagine. I gave her your number with your permission, of course." David blinked, his mind racing. Meet him? Why? He didn't need thanks. He didn't deserve it, really. He'd just done what any decent person would do. Still, he found himself mumbling, "All right, thank you for letting me know, document." "Take care, Mr. Parker," Dr. Ellis said, and the line went dead. David set the phone down and rubbed his temples, exhaling deeply. His morning routine felt off now. He tried to shake it as he grabbed his keys, but something tugged at the back of his mind. As he slipped into his old taxi and turned the key in the ignition, the engine rumbled to life with its familiar hum. Somehow, though, even the hum felt different. He couldn't explain it. For the next few hours, David drove his usual routes. The quiet comfort of routine started to wash over him again. He picked up Mr. Thompson, the retired postman, and dropped him off at the hardware store. Then Mrs. Callahan, who chatted endlessly about her granddaughter's piano recital as she clutched a bag of knitting supplies. David nodded politely, grateful for the familiarity. But mid-morning, when the lull of the day began to settle, David's phone rang again. He parked the taxi under a shady tree before answering. "Hello? Mr. Parker?" It was a woman's voice, soft and fragile but unmistakably familiar. "This is Claire. You drove me and my son yesterday to the hospital." David's grip tightened slightly on the phone. "Oh. Yes, ma'am. I remember. I hope I'm not bothering you," she said quickly, her voice catching slightly. I just wanted to speak to you. I don't know how to say this, but, thank you. Thank you so much. You didn't have to help us, but you did. And because of you, my son is alive." David swallowed the sudden lump in his throat. "Ma'am, you don't have to thank me. I was just doing my job." "No, you don't understand," Claire said, her voice trembling. "If it hadn't been for you, I would have lost him." She paused, and David heard her take a shaky breath. "I'd like to meet you. Please. Just for a few minutes. I want to tell you something important." David opened his mouth to protest, but something stopped him. There was something in her voice, a desperation, a rawness, that made him pause. "All right," he said finally. "Where would you like to meet? Are you working right now?" Claire asked softly. "Yes," David said. "Could you meet me at the park? The one near the hospital. My son and I are here now. He wanted to see you too." The park. David knew it well. It wasn't far, just a few minutes' drive from where he sat. He agreed and hung up, his mind spinning. Why did this feel so big? It wasn't like he'd pulled the boy out of a burning building. He'd driven a taxi. That was it. He shook his head and started the car, pulling out onto the road. When David pulled up to the park, he spotted them immediately. Claire sat on a bench beneath a tall maple tree, her little boy beside her, clutching a stuffed bear in his arms. David hesitated before stepping out of the car. The boy noticed him first, his face lighting up as he pointed. "Mom! That's him." Claire stood quickly, brushing a hand nervously through her hair. "Mr. Parker." David nodded, managing a small smile. "Morning, ma'am." "Please, call me Claire," she said, extending her hand. David shook it, noticing how small and fragile it felt in his rough palm. The little boy beamed up at him. "Hi, mister." "Hey, kiddo," David said softly. "How are you feeling?" "Better," the boy said, clutching his bear tightly. "Mom says you're a hero." David blinked, surprised. "A hero?" "Nah, kid. I'm just a taxi driver." Claire's eyes welled with tears as she placed a hand on her son's shoulder. "You don't know what you did for us," she said quietly. "It wasn't just driving us to the hospital. You refused my money. You didn't ask questions. You were just there when we needed someone. People don't do that anymore." David shifted awkwardly. "It wasn't a big deal, ma'am." "But it was," Claire insisted. "I was rushing to save my son's life, and you saved mine, too. You reminded me that there are good people in this world. People who care. You don't know how rare that is." For a moment, the three of them stood in silence beneath the rustling maple tree. The breeze carried the faint sound of laughter from children playing on the swings nearby. David didn't know what to say. He'd spent most of his life feeling invisible, a man people barely noticed as they handed him a few crumpled bills and hurried off to their destinations. And now, here he was, standing in front of a woman who looked at him as though he'd moved mountains. "Is there anything I can do for you?" Claire asked suddenly. "Anything at all. I just want to repay you." David shook his head quickly. "No, ma'am. Please. You don't owe me anything." Claire studied him for a long moment. "People like you don't come around often, Mr. Parker. Thank you for being there when no one else was." David looked down at the boy, whose small smile was a beam of pure innocence. "Take care of your mom, all right, kid? She's lucky to have you." The boy nodded enthusiastically, and Claire's tears finally spilled over. She wiped them away quickly, laughing softly through her sobs. "You're a good man, Mr. Parker. I won't forget this. Ever." David nodded, unsure what else to say. He watched them walk away. The little boy clutching his bear, chattering happily to his mother. And as he stood there in the quiet park, David realized that something had shifted inside him. He wasn't just a taxi driver anymore. He'd become part of someone's story, and in doing so, his own story had changed forever. David sat in his taxi for a long time after Claire and her son disappeared into the distance. The quiet of the park seemed louder than usual, the rustling of the maple trees and the distant sound of children laughing blending into something almost surreal. For years, his world had been predictable, days spent driving the same streets, seeing the same people, and listening to the hum of his engine. But now, there was a crack in that predictable world, and through it shone something he couldn't quite define. He started the engine, the sound startling him from his thoughts. The park bench where Claire had sat seemed almost sacred now, as though something larger than himself had happened there. As he pulled back onto the road, his mind replayed her words, "You saved his life. People like you don't come around often." It wasn't a compliment David knew how to accept. He wasn't a hero. Heroes were firefighters, doctors, or soldiers. Not a man who spent his days staring at the rearview mirror, listening to static-filled radio stations. He wasn't used to mattering. Not really. The day wore on, and David fell back into his routine, but it wasn't the same. The faces of his passengers blurred in his mind, their conversations washed out like background noise. He found himself glancing at his phone every so often, half expecting another call, though none came. By the time evening rolled around, he parked the taxi behind his house, sighing as he leaned back in his seat. He was exhausted, but it wasn't the physical kind of exhaustion. It was deeper. When he stepped inside, the smell of dinner greeted him. Anna had cooked stew, and Josh sat at the table, chewing thoughtfully as his math book lay open beside him. Anna glanced at David as he hung up his keys. "You're late," she said lightly. "Yeah," David muttered, rubbing his neck. "Had a long day." Anna raised an eyebrow but didn't press him. She was used to him being quiet when something weighed on his mind. David sat at the table, his thoughts still 1,000 miles away as he pushed food around his bowl. Josh was the one to break the silence. "Dad, Mom said you saved someone yesterday," Josh blurted out, looking at him with a mixture of awe and curiosity. David froze mid-bite. "Your mom told you that?" Anna shrugged. "He overheard me on the phone with my sister. She wouldn't stop asking why you seemed distracted last night." David put his spoon down and stared at his son. "It's not like that, kiddo. I didn't save anyone. I just did my job." Josh furrowed his brows. "But Mom said the boy would've." "That's enough, Josh," Anna interrupted softly. "Let your dad eat." David felt his cheeks flush. He hadn't told Anna everything yet, the hospital call, the meeting at the park. How could he explain it without sounding foolish? It wasn't like he'd lifted the boy out of a burning car. He'd just been there at the right time, in the right place. Luck, that's all it was. Or at least, that's what he told himself. Later that night, David found himself standing on the back porch, staring at the stars scattered across the dark sky. The cool breeze kissed his face, and the quiet settled around him like a blanket. He thought of Claire and her son, wondering how they were doing. He remembered the little boy's voice, soft but bright with gratitude, saying, "Mom says you're a hero." David scoffed to himself. A hero? David? He turned to find Anna standing in the doorway, her arms crossed as she studied him. She stepped closer, joining him under the stars. "What's going on with you?" she asked quietly. "Nothing," he muttered. "David, I've known you for 20 years. You're not a man who gets distracted. Talk to me." He sighed, running a hand over his face before leaning back against the porch railing. "It's stupid," he began slowly. "It's nothing, really. Just a woman I drove to the hospital yesterday. Her kid was sick. I didn't take her money. That's all." Anna frowned. "That's all?" David hesitated, then continued. "The kid, he wouldn't have made it if I hadn't taken them when I did. The doctor called me last night. He said I saved the boy's life." Anna's expression softened, her eyes searching his face. "David, that's not nothing." "I didn't do anything special," David insisted, his voice firm but unsure. "Anyone would have done the same thing." "But you did it," Anna said, stepping closer. "David, you never give yourself credit for anything, and I don't understand why. You helped that family when they were desperate. Don't you see how important that is?" David looked away, his chest tight. "I don't want to be important," he murmured. I don't know." David stared at the envelope on the passenger seat as though it might catch fire. The check inside burned a hole through his thoughts, no matter how hard he tried to focus on the road. For a man like him, someone who spent his life counting every dollar to make ends meet, it was an absurd sum of money. Enough to pay off the lingering debts from the repair shop he'd lost years ago. Enough to fix his old car, maybe even replace it. Enough to finally let his family breathe. And yet, it felt wrong. The taxi crawled through Maple Ridge's familiar streets, but David's mind was miles away. He glanced at the check again at a red light, his name written neatly in black ink beside the shocking amount. Claire's words echoed in his head. "Because of you, my son is alive." The light turned green, but David didn't move. A car behind him blared its horn, and he jolted forward as though waking from a trance. He couldn't stop thinking about Claire and her son, how terrified they must have been. In his mind, he could still see her pale face as she clutched her boy's hand, the sheer panic in her voice when she'd told him to hurry. What if she hadn't found a taxi? What if he hadn't been there at that exact moment? "Stop it," he muttered under his breath, gripping the steering wheel tightly. It wasn't luck or fate. It was just coincidence, wasn't it? He'd been in the right place at the right time. That was all. But deep down, he didn't believe that. The day passed in a blur. Passengers came and went, their faces a hazy procession of smiles, sighs, and hurried chatter. David barely heard them. When he finally parked the taxi that evening, the envelope was still sitting where he'd left it, as pristine as it had been that morning. He stared at it for a long moment before snatching it up and heading inside. Anna was washing dishes when he walked into the kitchen, the faint sound of a country song playing on the radio. She looked up when she saw him and frowned. "You look like you've seen a ghost. Everything all right?" David didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked to the table and set the envelope down. "I need to show you something." Anna dried her hands on a dish towel, her expression shifting from curiosity to concern as she sat across from him. David slid the check out and pushed it toward her. "What's this?" she asked softly. "It's from the woman I told you about," David replied. "Claire. The one with the sick boy." Anna's eyes widened as she read the note, her voice a whisper. "David, this is," she trailed off, staring at the amount. "I know." She looked up at him, her brow furrowed. "What did you do for her?" "Nothing." David's voice was strained. "I just drove her to the hospital. I didn't ask for this. I didn't earn this." Anna stared at him for a long moment, then reached across the table to touch his hand. "David, listen to me. You may not think you earned it, but to her, you saved her son's life. You were there when no one else was." He pulled his hand back, shaking his head. "I don't want it, Anna. It doesn't feel right. I don't deserve it." Anna sat back in her chair, studying him with that steady gaze of hers that always seemed to see straight through him. "So what are you going to do? Give it back?" David opened his mouth, then closed it again. The truth was, he didn't know. Part of him wanted to march right back to Claire and tell her to take it back. The money was too much, too big, too heavy. And yet, another part of him, the part that had spent years juggling bills and sacrificing little comforts for his family, couldn't ignore what it could mean for them. The next day, David woke early and found himself driving aimlessly around town before the morning rush began. He avoided his usual spots, as though somehow hiding from his own thoughts. Finally, he stopped outside the hospital, staring at the building from the curb. He didn't even know if Claire would be there, but he had to try. Inside, the hospital lobby buzzed with quiet urgency. Nurses moved briskly through the halls, patients sat hunched in plastic chairs, and the faint smell of antiseptic filled the air. David approached the front desk, feeling awkward and out of place. A woman in scrubs looked up from her computer. "Can I help you?" she asked. "I'm looking for someone," David said, clearing his throat. "Her name's Claire. She was here yesterday with her son. Is there any way to—" Before he could finish, a familiar voice spoke behind him. "Mr. Parker?" David turned to find Claire standing a few feet away, holding a small cup of coffee. She looked tired, but her face softened into a smile when she saw him. "What are you doing here?" David hesitated, glancing down at the envelope in his hand. I need to talk to you. Claire nodded, motioning for him to follow her. They walked out into the hospital's small garden, a quiet space with a few benches surrounded by neatly trimmed hedges. The morning air was crisp, and the faint chirp of birds filled the silence as they sat down. David held out the envelope. I can't take this. Claire frowned slightly. Why not? Because it's too much, David said firmly. I don't deserve it. All I did was drive you here. That's my job. I didn't save your boy's life. The doctors did. Claire stared at him for a long moment, her eyes glistening. You don't understand, Mr. Parker. You don't see what I see. David frowned, unsure of what she meant. Claire looked down at her hands, her voice soft. Yesterday, I wasn't sure we were going to make it. My son was barely breathing, and I was losing hope. I ran into the street because I didn't know what else to do. And then you pulled up, out of nowhere. You didn't ask questions. You didn't care that I didn't have the money. You just helped me. She looked up, meeting his gaze. That's more than most people would do. David shook his head. But this money isn't a payment, Claire interrupted gently. It's a thank you. It's a way for me to show you how much your kindness meant to us. You didn't just save my son's life. You reminded me that there's good in the world. David's throat tightened. He looked down at the envelope, his hands trembling slightly. I don't know what to say. Say you'll use it, Claire said softly. Say you'll take it and do something good with it. For yourself. For your family. David looked away, the weight of her words settling over him like a heavy blanket. He thought of Anna and Josh. He thought of the bills piling up on their kitchen counter, the repairs his old taxi desperately needed. He thought of the years he'd spent struggling, never asking for help, never expecting anything more than what he had. Finally, he nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. All right. Claire smiled, tears shining in her eyes. Thank you, Mr. Parker. For everything. David stood and tucked the envelope carefully into his coat pocket, his mind still spinning. As he walked back to his taxi, he felt something shift inside him. He didn't know if it was relief or acceptance, but for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he deserved this. That afternoon, David sat in his taxi at his usual spot near the town square. The streets were alive with the hum of Maple Ridge's daily routine, but for David, everything felt different. The sun was a little warmer, the air a little lighter. He stared at the envelope in his hand one last time before slipping it into the glove box. He didn't know what the future held, but for now, he was ready to face it. And somewhere, deep down, he knew this was only the beginning. David sat in his taxi at the edge of Maple Ridge's town square, the afternoon sun streaming through the windshield and casting thin beams of warmth across his worn dashboard. The envelope was tucked securely in the glove box, hidden away, yet its weight lingered in his mind as though he were still holding it. He had accepted it, reluctantly, quietly, but now the hard part had begun, figuring out what to do next. For years, David had moved through life like a man carrying an invisible burden, shoulders always slightly hunched, eyes trained downward. He'd accepted his lot, modest work, a humble home, and nights spent staring at bills that never seemed to shrink. He was used to being the guy no one noticed. The guy people nodded at in passing, maybe offered a polite hello before going about their day. But now, everything felt unsteady, as though the world had tilted on its axis and left him stumbling to find his footing. David was still parked there when the knock on his driver's window startled him. He jumped slightly and turned to see Mr. Thompson, the retired postman, peering in with a grin. David rolled down the window. "You asleep in there, Parker?" Mr. Thompson chuckled. "Looked like you were daydreaming." Just thinking, David replied, forcing a smile. Need a ride somewhere? Nope. Just saw you sitting here like a statue and figured I'd say hello. Haven't seen you look this lost since they closed down your shop years back. Everything all right? David hesitated, his fingers drumming lightly against the steering wheel. Mr. Thompson had a knack for seeing through people, his decades of delivering mail having made him an expert on small-town lives. He could sense when someone's day wasn't going quite right. Yeah, David said finally. Just, got a lot on my mind. Mr. Thompson murmured, leaning an elbow against the car door. Well, don't think too hard about it, Parker. Life's too short to be worrying when you don't need to. David offered a faint nod as Mr. Thompson straightened up and walked off, his cane tapping rhythmically on the pavement. Life's too short. The word stuck with David as he restarted the taxi and pulled away. When David returned home that evening, he found Anna sitting at the kitchen table with an old ledger open in front of her. Her brow was furrowed as she ran a finger down a column of numbers, stopping to jot a note on a scrap of paper beside her. Josh sat nearby, headphones on, bobbing his head to music as he flipped through a textbook. Something wrong? David asked, setting his keys on the counter. Anna glanced up, offering a small smile. Just going over the bills. Trying to see if there's anywhere we can cut back. David's stomach tightened. He'd seen that look on her face more times than he could count, determined, quiet, but weighed down by stress she tried to hide from him. He glanced toward the hallway, where his coat hung on a hook, the envelope still tucked inside its pocket. Anna, he said carefully, what if I told you we didn't need to worry about those bills anymore? She frowned. What do you mean? David hesitated before pulling the envelope from his coat and placing it on the table. Anna stared at it, confusion flickering across her face until he opened it and slid the check toward her again. David, she whispered, her voice filled with disbelief. You're really keeping this? I am, David said softly. It's not a payment. It's not charity. Claire said it herself, it's a thank you. She wanted me to use it for something good, and I think it's time I did. Anna's eyes searched his face, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she smiled, a real, genuine smile that lit up her tired features in a way he hadn't seen in years. What are you going to do with it? I don't know yet, David admitted. But I think it's time we start dreaming a little. Over the next few days, David's mind raced with possibilities. Every time he thought about the money, his thoughts shifted to the past, to the repair shop he'd lost. It had been his pride, a small business he'd poured his heart and soul into, fixing cars and building a reputation for honesty and hard work. When the debts had grown too large, and the bank had come knocking, it had felt like losing a part of himself. After that, driving a taxi had been the only thing he could do to keep food on the table. But now, with this unexpected gift, the future seemed to crack open, wide and uncertain. One afternoon, as David drove his taxi along the edge of town, he found himself pulling into the parking lot of the old repair shop. The building still stood, though the windows were dusty, and the paint on the sign had begun to peel. It had been empty for years, a hollow shell of what it used to be. He stepped out of the taxi and stood there for a long time, staring at the place he'd once called his second home. Memories flooded back, of grease-stained hands, the hum of engines, and satisfied customers shaking his hand as they left. Thinking of buying it back? David turned sharply to see Mr. Thompson again, leaning on his cane near the sidewalk, as though he'd been waiting for him. What are you doing here? David asked. Old men like me don't have much else to do except wander around town, Mr. Thompson replied with a grin. And I've got a nose for when something interesting's happening. David shook his head, chuckling softly despite himself. I don't know if I can do it, Mr. Thompson. It's been years. I wouldn't even know where to start. Start where you left off, Mr. Thompson said simply. The world hasn't changed that much, Parker. People still need good mechanics, and you're the best this town ever had. We all remember that. David blinked, surprised. You think people would still come here? Of course they would, Mr. Thompson said firmly. You're not invisible, Parker, no matter how much you think you are. Folks remember the ones who do right by them. You've always been one of the good ones. David looked back at the building, his heart pounding. The idea felt enormous, but for the first time in years, it didn't feel impossible. That night, David sat at the kitchen table with Anna, spreading out papers and scribbling down numbers. The check sat nearby, a reminder of the possibility they held in their hands. Anna leaned over his shoulder, reading as he wrote. You really want to do this? She asked quietly. David looked up at her, determination in his eyes. Yeah. I think it's time. She smiled and squeezed his shoulder. Then let's do it. The next few weeks were a blur of phone calls, meetings with the bank, and trips to the hardware store. David spent every spare moment cleaning up the old repair shop, sweeping away the dust and repainting the walls until it looked like new. Word began to spread through Maple Ridge that David Parker was reopening his shop, and to his surprise, people began showing up even before the doors were ready. You're back? A man asked one morning as he stood in the doorway, holding his car keys. Yeah, David said with a small smile. I'm back. On opening day, the parking lot was packed. Cars lined up around the block, and neighbors stopped by just to shake David's hand. Mr. Thompson was there, grinning like he'd known all along how it would turn out. Anna and Josh stood by his side, beaming with pride. As David wiped grease from his hands and looked out over the crowd, he realized something profound. Claire's gift had been more than money. It had been a second chance, not just for him, but for his family, and for the small town that had quietly believed in him all along. When the day ended, and the last car drove away, David leaned against the counter, exhausted but fulfilled. Anna walked over and kissed his cheek. You did it, she said softly. David smiled, his heart full. No, he replied, looking out at the shop he'd brought back to life. We did it. And somewhere, in the quiet of his mind, he thought of Claire and her son. He hoped they were doing well, because without them, he wouldn't be standing here, reclaiming his future. It was proof that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness could ripple outwards, changing lives in ways no one could ever predict. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. David Parker's repair shop was alive again, and with it, so was he. The clang of tools, the hum of engines, and the smell of grease filled the air every morning as he unlocked the doors and prepared for the day's work. For years, David had thought of this place as his greatest failure, a constant reminder of what he had lost. Now, it was his greatest triumph, a symbol of redemption born from an act of kindness he had never expected to matter so much. Word had spread far beyond Maple Ridge that David was back in business. People from neighboring towns came to him, not just because he was a good mechanic, though he was, but because they trusted him. They knew his reputation, honest, hardworking, and kind. It wasn't long before customers began sharing stories with him while he worked under hoods and checked tires. Stories about how someone had helped them in unexpected ways or how a stranger's small gesture had changed the course of their lives. It seemed as though his own story, his small moment of kindness, had sparked something bigger, something that rippled through the people around him. But the shop wasn't the only thing that had changed. At home, David was different, too. He smiled more. He laughed at Josh's corny jokes over dinner and teased Anna about her obsession with baking shows. Even the house seemed lighter, like the weight of years of struggle had been lifted from its walls. They had paid off their debts, repaired the leaky roof, and even started saving again. It wasn't that life was suddenly perfect, but there was peace in their home now. One afternoon, as David was finishing up a job, a young couple's car that had broken down on their way to their honeymoon, he heard the chime of the front door bell. He wiped his hands on a rag and stood, expecting to see another customer. Instead, standing in the doorway was Claire, holding a small bouquet of wildflowers and a shy smile. Beside her stood her son, his face bright with excitement as he clutched a drawing in his hands. David froze for a moment, surprised. "Claire?" "Hello, Mr. Parker," she said warmly. "I hope we're not interrupting." "No, not at all," David said, stepping forward. "What brings you back to Maple Ridge?" Claire handed him the bouquet. "I thought it was time I stopped by. I heard about the shop reopening, and I wanted to see it for myself." David accepted the flowers, feeling a mix of surprise and gratitude. "It's good to see you both." He glanced down at the boy, who was staring up at him with wide eyes. "You're looking strong, kid. How've you been?" The boy beamed and held out the drawing. "This is for you." David took it carefully and smiled as he unfolded it. It was a crayon drawing of a taxi, a boxy, bright yellow car with a smiling driver inside. At the top, written in large, shaky letters, were the words, "Thank you for being our hero." David's throat tightened, and for a moment, he couldn't speak. He looked at Claire, who was watching him with tears in her eyes. "He talks about you all the time," she said softly. "To him, you're the man who saved the day. And honestly, you are to me, too." David cleared his throat, trying to steady his voice. "I'm just glad you're both doing well." Claire nodded. "We are. He's healthy now, thanks to the treatment. He still remembers that day, though. How scared we were. How you were there when we needed someone most." David looked down at the drawing again, his heart swelling with an emotion he couldn't quite name. The moment felt surreal, like something out of a story rather than his own life. "Thank you," he said finally. "I'll hang this up in the shop." The boy grinned, and Claire reached out to squeeze David's arm. "We'll never forget you, Mr. Parker." "You don't need to keep thanking me," David said softly. "You've already done more than enough." Claire smiled. "It's not about what we've done. It's about letting you know that you matter. What you did mattered." David watched them walk back to their car, the boy waving one last time before they drove away. He stood there for a moment, the bouquet of wildflowers in one hand and the crayon drawing in the other. The sun was starting to set, casting golden light across the parking lot and making the shop's windows glow. As David walked back inside, he tacked the drawing onto the bulletin board behind the counter. Customers would see it when they came in, and maybe, just maybe, it would remind someone else that even the smallest kindness could change a life. In the months that followed, David found himself at the heart of the town's quiet transformation. It started small. One day, an elderly man came into the shop, clearly flustered because his tire had blown out, and he didn't have enough cash to replace it. David thought back to Claire and the boy. Without hesitation, he fixed the tire free of charge, refusing to take a dime. The next day, that same elderly man left a loaf of freshly baked bread on David's doorstep, along with a handwritten note, "Thank you for your kindness." The story spread, and soon, little acts of generosity began popping up across Maple Ridge. A diner owner paid for a single mother's lunch. A teacher bought shoes for one of her struggling students. Neighbors offered rides to people who needed them, and groceries appeared mysteriously on doorsteps for families going through hard times. David noticed the change, even if no one said it outright. People were more open, more willing to look out for each other. And though no one ever traced it back to him, David knew, deep down, that it had all started with one ride, one moment, one small decision to refuse payment from a crying mother. One evening, as David closed up the shop, Josh came to meet him. The boy was taller now, almost 17, and growing into the kind of young man David had always hoped he'd become. Josh leaned against the counter, watching his father wipe down tools. "You ever think about how one little thing can change everything?" Josh asked suddenly. David paused, glancing over his shoulder. What do you mean? Josh shrugged. Like, you picking up that lady and her kid. You didn't have to stop, you know. You could have kept driving. But you didn't. David set down his rag and turned to face his son. Sometimes you don't think about things like that, he said quietly. Sometimes you just do what feels right. Josh nodded thoughtfully. Well, it was a good thing you did. He smiled faintly. You know, people talk about you, Dad. They say you're the kind of person who doesn't ask for anything but always gives. David's heart swelled as he looked at his son, standing tall and proud in the shop he'd worked so hard to bring back to life. I'm just doing what I can, he said softly. Yeah, Josh replied, smiling. But that's what makes you special. That night, David stood on the back porch, looking up at the same stars he'd stared at months earlier when everything had first begun. Life hadn't turned him into a rich man, but it had made him something better, someone who mattered, not just to his family but to the people around him. It had started with a single moment, a decision to show kindness to someone in need. And now, as he looked out at the quiet town he called home, David realized that kindness was like a flame, small at first, but powerful enough to spread and light up the darkest places. He closed his eyes, the crinkle of the little boy's drawing still fresh in his memory. He thought of Claire, her son, and everyone else who had become part of his story. And he smiled. For the first time in his life, David Parker knew he had made a difference. And that was worth more than anything in the world.